Hey, hello guys, this is part 2 for section 2 solving a one-step equation. And in my first video, I explained the relationship between an equation and a balance scale. So just keep in mind what a balance scale is, and that in order to keep a balance in a balance scale, you always have to do whatever you do to one side, you have to do it to the other side. So we're going to continue with the examples today, and we are going to solve. These examples here, we have double negatives, or you guys can say a negative times a negative. If you look at the different questions I have here, notice that on this side here, we have a negative times a negative, or like I say, double negative. We do have a negative times a negative here, double negatives here. And the last two examples I want to show you is, some people think that every time you have a negative inside of parentheses, you have to multiply a negative times a negative. But you'll see that in this one and in this one, that's not the case. But let's go ahead and look at the first question here. And we have x minus 5 equals 3 minus the quantity of negative 4. So like I mentioned, we do have a double negative, and I'm just going to put a box around so you can see those double negatives. Negative and a negative. When you guys have a double negative, which means you multiply a negative times a negative, well, that's going to turn positive. So I'm just going to put a plus around, or not around, but changing that sign. Let me just delete this box here. And the plus right here, and the plus right here. So when I rewrite the equation, I'm going to have x minus 5 equals 3 plus 4. Now, why plus? One more time. This negative times a negative became a positive. Every time you guys want to solve, you always simplify first. And we do have like terms on the right side of the equation. Let me just put the line under the equation so you can see the right side. And those two numbers are constants. So you can add 3 plus 4, which is 7. On the left side, you just have an x minus 5. Step number 2, you eliminate the constants on the same side of the variable. So the variable is x, this is the constant. So you do the inverse operation, which is the opposite. So we are going to add 5 to both sides. And like a balance scale, whatever you do to one side, you have to do it to the other side. So this negative 5 plus 5 cancels 0. You don't need that 0. You bring down the x, you put the equal sign again, and you add the numbers over here. 7 plus 5 equals 12. So let's look at another example here. I want to show you when you guys have a variable inside of the parentheses, and it is a negative times a negative. So first of all, let's understand why we have a double negative or negative times a negative. If you guys look at these two signs right here, negative, and there's a parenthesis in the middle, that is a double negative. You have to multiply negative times negative. So that's going to become positive. Let me just put the plus again here so we can see plus and a plus. So you bring down the negative 5, you make that a plus, x, no more parentheses because you already changed that negative and a negative to a positive, equals, and we have a negative 10. So notice what happens with the negatives one more time. Negative times a negative will be a positive. Now, I'm going to put the line under the equal sign. I'm going to look at the side with the variable. So here's my constants, and I'm going to eliminate the constants on the same side of the variable. I do the opposite. So I add 5 to both sides, 1 on the left, 1 on the right. So when I cancel these two numbers, negative 5 plus 5, they're opposites from each other. So that's going to equal 0. You don't need to put the 0. I'm going to bring down the x. So there's a positive x, no more plus, it's just an x. And on the other side, you guys are going to combine the numbers right here. And it is a negative 10 plus 5. They do have different signs. So you subtract the numbers and keep the sign of the biggest number. So the biggest number is negative, and let me just change the color here, negative, and you subtract, so 5, negative 5, x equals negative 5. Now there's some special cases where some people think that you do have a double negative and you have to multiply the two signs, but that's not the case when you guys have a plus and a minus. So look at this example, guys. We do have an x, we do have a plus, the quantity of negative 7, I'm saying quantity because we have parentheses, equals 21. Notice that we do not have a negative and a negative. What we have is a positive and a negative. So you do not change the sign when you guys have these type of equations. Do not change the sign. All you have to do is you have to get the x by itself. So let me just erase this box here. And putting the line under the equal sign, I'm going to get rid of the number, the constants on the same side of the variable. So the constants, here's the variable, the constant is negative 7. I know we do have parentheses, and notice that we don't have anything outside. So basically, you just ignore the parentheses here, ignore this plus here, and you're going to do the opposite of the number inside of the parentheses. We have a negative, so the opposite will be a positive. So you add 7, and on the other side, you add a 7. These two numbers, negative 7 plus 7, cancel. You bring down the x, and on the other side, 21 plus 7 is 28. So my answer will be x equals 28. Now this example, it might look like a negative times a negative, a double negative, but notice that the negative 10, this negative is not next to the negative x. You have a number in between. So when you guys have something in between the negatives, that's not a double negative. Let me just refresh your memory and show you where you can see a negative times a negative. Like example over here, even though I didn't do this example, you guys do have a negative times a negative. Negative, negative, and parentheses in between. There's no number or a variable in between those two negatives. So when you guys have this type of equation, do not change the sign. You guys need to get the x by itself. So first, you get rid of the constants on the same side. So we do have a negative 10 here. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to add 10 to both sides and add 10 over here. So we are going to cancel negative 10 plus 10, and you bring down the negative with the x. You have to keep that negative. If you don't put that negative, you are saying the x is positive, but it is a negative. On the other side, 21 plus 10 is 31. You also have to get rid of this negative because your answer can never have a negative variable. So all we're going to do now is divide by negative 1 to get rid of that negative. And you guys divide by negative 1 on the other side. So why am I dividing by negative 1? Well, this negative next to the x is a negative 1. You have an invisible 1. So when you divide these two numbers, negative 1 divided by negative 1, that turns into a positive 1. We don't need it. You just bring down the x. On the other side, we do have a positive 31 divided by negative 1, and that's going to be a negative 31. Now moving on with the next type of equations, fractions. I know that sometimes people don't like fractions, but the easiest way to do fractions or to work with fractions is by eliminating, canceling the fractions, get rid of fractions, and then after you get rid of fractions, you can start solving for the variable. So let's look at the first one right here. Now the equation is x divided by 9 equals 10. I know some people might say x over 9 equals 10, and that is correct. But you have to understand that this line right here means division. You are dividing. X divided by 9 equals 10. You guys look up here that it says solving by multiplying. Why does it say multiplying? Well, the opposite inverse operation of division is multiplication. So you guys will have to multiply. Now, what do you have to multiply when you have a fraction? You are going to multiply everything by the denominator. Denominator in this case is 9. So you multiply by 9. And the balance scale, remember you have to keep a balance. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do it to the other side. So when you guys multiply, you can put a 1 under this 9 here because we have a fraction inside the parentheses. You can multiply the top, 9x, and you multiply the bottom. 1 times 9 is 9. And the other side, 10 times 9 is 90. You guys need to simplify the fraction. 9, or reduce the fraction. 9 divided by 9 is 1. So that's just an x. On the other side is a 90. So that's my answer. X equals 90. But the big concept is you multiply by the denominator. Now what about if you have a number on top of the fraction? So let's look at the other example. So this example here, you guys have a 5 on top of the fraction, a 9 on the bottom, and the p is on the right side of the fraction. That's okay. You still have a fraction. But you guys are going to multiply by the denominator, and the denominator, one more time, it is 9. So I'm going to multiply this by 9, and I'm going to multiply the other side by 9. Now you guys can make a fraction. The 9 outside, you put a 1 under the 9. But guess what? You do not have to do that every time. When you guys multiply the 9 times the number inside of the parentheses, all you have to do, guys, remember, this is what you can do. Multiply the top, 9 times 5. That's a 45. And you keep the denominator. And then you bring down the variable. On the other side, you do have to multiply 9 times negative 10, and that's negative 90. You guys reduce the fraction, 45 divided by 9, which is 5. P equals negative 90. Now remember that this right here, you are multiplying 5 times P. So what you have to do is get rid of this 5, so you divide. So you are going to divide by 5, you divide by 5. So this 5 divided by 5 turns into 1. You bring down the P equals negative 18. So there is my answer. Now I'm going to show you guys when you guys have a negative fraction and you guys have a variable c. So same thing, same process. You are going to multiply by the denominator to get rid of the fraction. In this case, denominator is 3. And I'm going to multiply the other side by 3. So I'm going to bring down the line here so you guys can see the left and the right. You multiply 3 times negative 6. That will be negative 18. On the other side, you are going to multiply 3 times the top. But be careful. We do have a negative. And that negative is going to go to the 2. So you have a negative 2 times 3 equals negative 6. And you keep the denominator. And then you bring down the z. You are going to divide the fraction, negative 6 divided by 3. So let me bring down the negative 18 here. Negative 6 divided by 3 is negative 2z. And finally, you want to get the variable by itself. So the negative 2 is multiplying the z. There's nothing in between, so that's by default is multiplication. So we are going to do the opposite, divide by negative 2. And I divide the other side by a negative 2. So negative 18 divided by negative 2 will be positive 9. Negative divided by negative is a positive 9. And the other side, negative 2 divided by negative 2, that's 1. We don't need that 1, so we just put a z. You can also switch. Remember, you can flip your answer. C equals 9. But this is a way so you guys can get rid of fractions. And the last one I'm going to show you today is how to write an equation from a sentence and then solve that equation. So if you read the sentence here, it says 1/3 times a number is negative 8. So we know we have to multiply. We know what is 1/3. Number is just a variable. I'm going to pick the variable x. So I'm going to put the equation. I'm going to write it down. 1/3 times x. I don't need that times in the middle. Remember that when you don't have an operation in between, by default is multiplication. So you don't have to put times, the actual times symbol in between. And that's going to equal a negative 8. So guess what? You have a fraction. Let's get rid of fractions. You multiply by the denominator, which is 3, and the other side by 3. Whatever you do to one side, you do it to the other side. You multiply the top. 3 times 1 is 3, and you keep the denominator. Bring down the variable, equals negative 8 times 3, negative 24. You guys reduce the fraction. 3 divided by 3, 1. We don't need that 1. So it's going to be x equals negative 24. Alright guys, this concludes my video. Make sure that you guys are practicing and make sure you understand fractions. And every time you guys have a fraction in an equation, remember, multiply by the denominator to get rid of the fraction. I'll see you guys later.